Okay, what we're going to discuss now is the repository pattern that we're about to introduce into our application. And for a description of what this is, and this is from Martin Fowler in the Patterns of Enterprise Architecture book, he describes a repository as something that mediates between the domain and the data mapping layers, acting like an in-memory domain object collection. Aha, okay. And what we'll do is we'll explain what this really means. And what we are doing right now is we've got our web server, the Kestrel server in our API, and requests come into our controller endpoint. Now in our controllers, we're injecting the DB context, and our DB context represents a session with our database, and our DB context is translating the logic, the queries that we're writing in the controller, and fishing out the data from the database and then returning it to the controller so that could be returned to the client. What we are going to introduce is effectively a layer of abstraction. We're going to introduce the repository, so instead of the controller going directly to the DB context, it then uses our repository and executes the methods inside there. Now the repository is going to use the DB context to go and execute the logic inside this, but what we are doing is adding another layer of abstraction to this. And this may seem unnecessary. Some say that this is unnecessary because the DB context itself acts as not a repository as such, but acts as another pattern that we'll talk about later, the unit of work. And the DB sets that we create inside the DB context, well, they're like repositories. And that's a fair argument. But what we're going to take a look at is why we would still add this layer of abstraction from what is considered to be already the units of work and repository pattern in action inside the DB context. There are still reasons to use this, but you don't have to use it. So one of the reasons is that it encapsulates the logic. Inside our DB context, there's thousands of different methods you can use. Each DB context has DB sets. Those DB sets have hundreds of different methods that you can use inside the DB sets. You can use first or default, single or default. We can include things, we can get things, we can do many different things inside a DB context. And there are thousands of different methods that we can use. So by using a repository, we encapsulate the logic. And if a controller injects a repository, then it's only got access to 4 methods that we need that controller to have. For instance, anyway. So this repository example, a method to get a user, a method to get all users, a method to update a user, and then a method to save the changes. So that's the reason number one. It encapsulates the logic. Another good reason for using the repository pattern is to reduce duplicate query logic. So if we had a method in our users controller to get a user and included some related data, but we also needed that same logic in our message controller, and we also needed it in another controller as well, we would end up writing the same queries over and over again. If we use the repository, then we can create the logic in one place, and then we can simply execute the methods from the repository in our different controllers. What it also does is it promotes testability. If we were including testing, which we're not, then it's much easier to test against a repository than it is to test against a DB context. Entity Framework has made this easier now than it used to be, but still, it's still easier to test against an interface of a repository than it is to test against a DB context. Our repositories are going to have interfaces, and we're going to have an implementation class for the repository. So what we inject into our controllers is going to be the repository interface, and then we have an implementation class that contains all of the actual logic. Now if we were to introduce testing, then we wouldn't need to implement the methods inside the repository inside our unit tests. We could mock the repository, and we could even use a mocking framework, so we need to write hardly any code to mock the repository. And again, if we were coding directly against a DB context in our controllers, then that would make it more difficult. So what we're doing in this course is, even though we're not adding testing, if you wanted to add testing later on, it would be much easier to do this against a repository and an interface rather than doing it against the DB context directly. So those are the main reasons for using this particular pattern, and if we just take a look at its advantages, it minimizes duplicate query logic, It decouples our application from the persistence framework, and some would say that Entity Framework already does that, and that is correct. What Entity Framework doesn't do for us though is decentralize our queries. The repository pattern does allow us to do this, and our query logic is not going to be scattered throughout our application. It also allows us to change the object relational mapper easily. And the asterisk is there because nobody ever changes their object relational mapper. I've added it in as it's something that we could do, but it's not something that anybody actually does. If we did, though, then all we would need to do is change our repository methods, the logic inside them. The interface that the controllers would use would not change, because the idea of using the interface is it's a contract between the interface and the implementation. So the implementation class has to do what the interface says. If the interface says get users and return an IEnumerable of user, then the implementation class has to do that. So we would only need to change the logic inside the implementation, and we wouldn't need to change any of our controller methods. And as I mentioned, it does promote testability because we can easily mock a repository interface. And testing against the DB context is more difficult. Some disadvantages though, and why people would say don't do this. It's an abstraction of an abstraction. Entity Framework is an abstraction from our database. A repository is an abstraction from Entity Framework. Some would say that's an unnecessary abstraction. But I believe the benefits outweigh the disadvantages for this particular application, and certainly for this training course, because it's going to make our code more understandable and more usable as we go throughout building this application. Another disadvantage is that each root entity should have its own repository, which of course means more code. And another disadvantage is that we also need to implement the unit of work pattern, as what we're going to be doing is injecting different instances of the data context into different repositories. So later on we're going to need to introduce a pattern to control the transactions that are going on here. And that's a brief introduction of what we're doing and why, and now we'll go on and actually do it.